Welcome to tonight's cinematic survival story. Imagine a sky splitting open with fire, alarms screaming across an alien world, and one man forced to choose between saving himself or saving an entire planet. This is the story of Ethan, an outsider who arrived chasing admiration, only to face extinction measured in seconds, as gravity bends and cities tremble. Survival becomes more than staying alive. It becomes a question of who you are when everything collapses. Stay with us and step into the storm. Sirens tore through the Planetary Defense Center as the holographic sky ignited in crimson. A massive asteroid burned across the projection, its trajectory locked on Olivium's equator. Ethan stood at the center console, the glow reflecting in his widened eyes. 21 days. The countdown pulsed beside the impact marker like a dying heartbeat. Around him, blue-skinned engineers shouted coordinates, gravity models destabilizing on every screen. The floor vibrated as distant generators struggled under emergency load. Outside the reinforced dome, twin suns shimmered behind gathering radiation clouds. This was no diplomatic ceremony, no celebration. This was extinction calculated in kilometers per second. Ethan's fingers hovered over the interface, pulse racing faster than the alarm tones. The asteroid's mass updated again, larger than first estimated. Energy weapons would fracture, not destroy it. Evacuation grids flickered red. There would be no escape pods. Only one option remained: bend gravity itself, or watch the sky fall. The High Queen entered without ceremony, her sapphire robes catching the strobing emergency lights as the alarms continued to howl. Conversations died instantly. She moved toward the central hologram, studying the burning arc carving across their sky. "Impact probability?" she asked. 98%, a scientist whispered. Silence thickened the air. Then her luminous gaze shifted to Ethan. "Ambassador," she said calmly, though the floor trembled beneath them. "When survival strips away comfort and pride, who remains?" The question cut deeper than the sirens. Ethan opened his mouth, but no clever reply came. Around them, gravity simulations collapsed into red spirals. The countdown ticked down another hour. Engineers recalculated, failed, recalculated again. The Queen did not look at the asteroid. She looked only at him, as if the planet's fate hinged less on technology and more on the man standing before her. Ethan felt the weight of expectation settle heavier than any atmosphere. Evacuation protocols activated automatically, then collapsed just as quickly. Orbital transports could carry barely 2% of the population before impact. Atmospheric shields would not survive debris fragmentation. On the holographic map, potential escape corridors blinked out one by one, replaced by expanding red shockwave models. "Interstellar jump?" someone suggested. The navigation AI projected fuel reserves, insufficient by orders of magnitude. Even if a fleet launched now, radiation storms would shred them before clearing orbit. Outside the dome, wind currents intensified as gravitational anomalies began rippling across the upper atmosphere. The planet itself seemed to sense the incoming violence. Ethan studied the data streams scrolling past his visor display. There would be no lifeboats, no heroic last-minute departures. Olivium was too rooted, too dependent on its gravity grid to simply flee. The Queen's earlier question echoed in his mind. Survival would not be handed to them. It would have to be engineered, calculated, and paid for in full. Ethan's fingers moved across the central console, pulling up schematics of Olivium's planetary gravity grid. Towers spanned the equatorial belt, each capable of bending localized space-time for transportation and atmospheric balance. "We don't destroy it," he said, voice steady, despite the tremor in the floor. "We redirect it." The room fell silent as he overlaid the asteroid's projected path with a corridor of calculated gravitational vectors. If every tower synchronized at maximum output, they could create a temporary curvature field, strong enough to nudge the asteroid off course. The margins were razor thin, one misalignment, and the corridor would collapse, amplifying the impact instead of deflecting it. Energy demand exceeded standard thresholds by 400%. Several regions would lose atmospheric stabilization during activation. Ethan zoomed in on the equatorial fault line where the primary generator stood. "I'll coordinate from there," he said. "If it fails with me inside." Simulations rolled across the central display in cascading layers of probability. Power redistribution required diverting atmospheric stabilizers from 3 major population zones. Storm models intensified instantly over those regions. Oxygen variance climbing beyond safe margins. Core pressure metrics spiked as gravitational harmonics overlapped unpredictably. "If synchronization drifts by more than 0.02%, Dr. Reth warned, tectonic shear will fracture the crust." Casualty projections updated in cold numerical columns, millions at risk if even one tower collapsed. Ethan studied the failure trees branching outward like veins of inevitability. To power the corridor, something would have to give. Comfort. Safety. Maybe entire cities. The High Queen did not interrupt. Her advisors whispered about sacrificial shutdowns and emergency relocations. Ethan felt the choice settle in his chest like a stone. Survival would demand imbalance. The corridor could save the planet, but only by shifting the danger somewhere else, somewhere painfully real. The chamber remained silent as the casualty projections stabilized on the screen. No configuration eliminated loss. Every path required sacrifice. Ethan inhaled slowly, feeling the vibration of distant generators through the floor. "Divert atmospheric stabilizers from the northern arc," he said at last. Gasps rippled across the council tiers. That region housed millions. "We rotate oxygen buffers in timed cycles," he continued, already adjusting parameters. "Short deprivation windows, manageable hypoxia instead of planetary extinction." He zoomed in on the equatorial primary tower perched along a tectonic fault. Radiation storms were already building there. "I'll take manual control on site. Synchronization drift won't exceed tolerance if I'm physically linked to the core." The High Queen studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. Orders transmitted across the planet. Transport crafts ignited. Ethan sealed his suit. Gravity fluctuations already tugging at his balance. The choice was made. Survival would begin at the fault line. The transport craft pierced the equatorial sky as radiation clouds twisted like living things below. Static cracked across Ethan's visor, sensor warnings cascading in rapid succession. When the hatch opened, heat and charged particles slammed into his suit, forcing servomotors to compensate instantly. The gravity tower loomed ahead, its spires bending under fluctuating space-time stress. Lightning arced horizontally through violet haze, striking the latticework with blinding bursts. Ethan advanced step by step, boots magnetizing to unstable ground as gravity surged and dropped without rhythm. His HUD registered rising exposure levels. Shielding would not hold indefinitely. Behind him, evacuation shuttles retreated toward safer latitudes, leaving the fault zone eerily empty. Another pulse rippled outward, nearly knocking him sideways. The tower's exterior panels buckled, seams glowing from overload. Ethan reached the access hatch, palm pressed to the biometric scanner. Above, the asteroid glimmered faintly, an approaching god of stone and fire. Inside the tower, the air shimmered with electromagnetic distortion. Support struts groaned as gravity flux oscillated beyond safe tolerances. Ethan sealed the hatch behind him, just as an external surge rattled the entire structure. Internal diagnostics flooded his visor: load imbalance, harmonic drift, core containment instability. The central shaft flickered with unstable blue light, energy conduits sparking like exposed nerves. He clipped his tether to the maintenance rail and descended into the vertical spine, boots scraping against trembling alloy. Midway down, a violent gravity inversion slammed him upward, harness locking at the last second. Below, a support ring fractured, debris spiraling weightless before crashing back with crushing force. The tower was tearing itself apart from internal strain. Ethan reached the primary junction node, fingers moving fast across manual override panels. If the structure failed before synchronization, the corridor would never form. Above him, another deep metallic crack echoed like a countdown. Ethan forced the manual override levers into alignment, sparks biting against his gloves as the junction node resisted recalibration. Harmonic drift warnings flashed red across his visor. He rerouted auxiliary power through a bypass conduit, sacrificing non-essential systems to stabilize the core. The tower shuddered violently, gravity pulsing in erratic waves that tugged at his limbs and twisted loose debris into orbit around him. He locked the synchronization frequency to the master grid and initiated a phased restart. For one suspended second, the energy spine dimmed to near darkness. Then the conduits reignited in a steady cobalt glow. Load metrics steadied within acceptable deviation. External telemetry confirmed the equatorial node had rejoined the network. Outside, the radiation storm bent subtly as the gravity field strengthened. It was only one tower among dozens, but the corridor had its first anchor point. Ethan exhaled slowly, knowing the real test had just begun. Ceres' holographic interface unfolded across the command grid, equations cascading in luminous spirals around her. She recalculated gravitational tolerances in real time, compensating for the equatorial tower's instability. Every millisecond of delay distorted the curvature field forming above the atmosphere. "Drift at 0.013, she transmitted, voice steady despite the alarms shrieking in the background. Ethan adjusted phase alignment inside the tower, matching her vector corrections. Ceres rerouted surplus energy from Kayla's sector, sacrificing atmospheric equilibrium for synchronization accuracy. Oxygen levels dipped in the northern arc. Alerts flared, but remained within survivable thresholds. She overlaid predictive trajectories of the asteroid fragments, accounting for solar wind interference and tectonic resonance. Sweat beaded along her temples as the simulations converged. "Lock now," she ordered. The gravity grid responded, its harmonic signature stabilizing into a coherent field. Precision, not force, would determine survival. And Ceres refused to let chaos win. Kayla moved through the secondary control chamber like controlled fire, her voice cutting cleanly through rising panic. Technicians faltered as atmospheric readings dipped again, but she steadied them with sharp, precise commands. "Rotate buffer cycles, 30-second intervals. No hesitation." Her hands glided over the interface, redistributing power surges before they cascaded into system-wide failure. Outside the dome, lightning crawled across the horizon as gravity waves distorted the sky. A junior engineer froze when casualty projections spiked. Kayla seized his wrist, forcing his attention back to the console. "We hold," she said. Not loudly, but with absolute certainty. The room synchronized around her resolve when a feedback surge threatened to overload the northern stabilizer array. She rerouted through auxiliary nodes without waiting for authorization. Oxygen variance steadied. Panic receded to focused urgency. Survival demanded momentum, and Kayla refused to let fear fracture the chain holding Olivium together. Aria remained in the life support nexus, surrounded by vertical streams of biometric data cascading across translucent screens. Every pulse from the fault zone transmitted through her console. Ethan's oxygen saturation, suit integrity, neural stress levels, radiation readings climbed steadily, pressing against shielding limits. She adjusted atmospheric redistribution models to prevent sudden decompression cycles in the northern arc, balancing millions of lives against a single man inside a collapsing tower. When Ethan's heart rate spiked during a gravity surge, her fingers flew across the interface, injecting micro-stabilization signals into his suit's servo feedback loop. The system resisted, latency creeping into the network. She rerouted through backup satellites, shaving milliseconds from transmission delay. "Stay steady," she murmured. Though he could not hear her, oxygen reserves in his suit ticked downward in quiet increments. Aria watched each percentage fall, calculating survival not as numbers, but as fragile continuity. Across Olivium's equator, gravity towers surged in synchronized sequence, their spires projecting invisible arcs into the upper atmosphere. Ethan braced inside the primary shaft as Ceres's final alignment code executed. For a breathless instant, every system hovered at maximum threshold. Then the grid ignited. Space itself seemed to ripple, bending subtly as a corridor of distorted gravity carved a path through vacuum. Atmospheric clouds stretched and twisted along the curvature line, twin suns refracting in warped halos. Energy feedback rattled the tower's interior, bolts shrieking against stressed metal. In orbit, satellites recorded the asteroid entering the outer edge of the corridor's pull. Its trajectory wavered, momentum resisting the imposed curvature. Ethan locked synchronization clamps as load percentages climbed into critical red. The corridor held, barely, across the planet. Millions watched the sky shimmer unnaturally, the first sign that survival might be possible. The asteroid crossed deeper into the gravity corridor, its surface fracturing under immense tidal stress. Telemetry spiked as mass and velocity fought against engineered curvature. Ethan gripped the console rail while the tower vibrated like a living organism under strain. In orbit, satellites recalculated trajectory in real time, projecting deviation arcs across the planetary grid. A fractional change appeared first, barely measurable, then another. The red impact line shifted by kilometers. Control chambers across Olivium erupted in restrained gasps as the asteroid's vector began to bend away from the equator. Gravity harmonics steadied, forming a coherent channel that guided the colossal rock along a new path. Load thresholds dipped slightly, granting a fragile margin of hope. Outside, the sky shimmered with warped starlight as space itself seemed to lean. For the first time since the alarm sounded, extinction no longer felt mathematically certain. Celebration died as quickly as it had begun. High-resolution orbital scans revealed fissures spreading across the asteroid's crust. Tidal forces from the corridor were tearing it apart. A violent rupture flashed across the surface, ejecting incandescent debris into multiple vectors. Ethan watched new red trajectories multiply across the hologram. each one smaller than the original, but still catastrophic. Fragment clusters dispersed unpredictably, some accelerating as they escaped the corridor's main curvature stream. "Recalculate immediately," Ceres transmitted, her voice sharp. Secondary impact zones bloomed across inhabited regions. The corridor had bent the giant, but now it had birthed a storm. Inside the tower, harmonic readings destabilized as gravity fields attempted to compensate for dozens of new masses instead of one. The sky outside fractured into streaks of burning light. Survival had shifted shape. The planet would not face a single blow but a rain of fire. The first fragment breached the upper atmosphere with a scream that drowned out every alarm. Fire split the sky into molten veins, shock waves racing ahead of the descending mass, orbital satellites shattered under kinetic debris, their feeds cutting to static one by one. In the defense center, impact markers bloomed across the planetary map like spreading wounds. A secondary fragment struck an oceanic plateau, vaporizing water into towering columns of steam. Tsunami projections spiraled outward. Ethan felt the tower tremble as gravitational harmonics struggled to adapt to multiple targets. The corridor wavered, forced to stretch beyond calibrated tolerances. Smaller fragments burned brighter as they fragmented again, multiplying chaos. Atmospheric pressure fluctuated violently in the northern arc, oxygen buffers nearing collapse. There would be no clean deflection now, only mitigation. The planet was under bombardment, and every second demanded impossible precision. Load indicators surged past safe thresholds as the gravity corridor attempted to compensate for dozens of incoming fragments. Inside the primary tower, containment rings glowed white-hot, metal warping under extreme harmonic pressure. Ethan's visor flooded with cascading error codes, core instability, synchronization drift, plasma backflow. A deep mechanical roar built beneath his boots as energy conduits overloaded in sequence. External lightning intensified, striking the spires repeatedly as atmospheric distortion amplified electromagnetic discharge. In the northern arc, stabilizer arrays failed one by one, oxygen variants spiking into lethal territory. Ceres transmitted recalibration vectors, but latency crept into the network as satellites dropped offline. The corridor flickered, bending space unevenly as gravitational pulses began overlapping destructively. One more surge, and the entire grid could implode, collapsing into a planetary-scale rupture. Ethan slammed emergency dampeners into place, knowing they would buy seconds, nothing more. Ethan disengaged the automated control loop and initiated full manual override, severing the tower from remote stabilization protocols. Warning glyphs flared across his visor as he descended deeper into the core chamber, where the gravity engine pulsed like a collapsing star. Heat radiated through layered shielding, suit temperature rising toward critical. He clamped a diagnostic tether directly into the primary conduit, bypassing corrupted AI routines. The corridor outside flickered violently, fragments streaking past in incandescent arcs. One misstep here would cascade into total grid failure. A sudden gravity inversion hurled him against the containment rail, cracking an external panel and venting plasma into the chamber. He crawled forward, fingers trembling, and aligned the core's phase modulators by hand. "Stabilize," he muttered, forcing the command through clenched teeth. The engine resisted, harmonics screaming. But the override channel finally accepted his authority. The core chamber convulsed as containment failed. A blinding surge erupted from the gravity engine, tearing through conduit lines in a chain reaction of white-hot plasma. Ethan barely registered the spike before the explosion detonated outward, vaporizing half the chamber in a thunderclap of compressed force. Shockwaves slammed him against the fractured wall, visor cracking under the impact. The tower's upper spires sheared away, spiraling into the storm-dark sky as debris rained across the fault zone. Outside, the gravity corridor flickered violently, destabilized by the sudden energy rupture. Fragment trails shifted unpredictably, some pulled back toward lethal vectors. Fire and electromagnetic arcs tangled in mid-air like living serpents. Ethan's tether snapped, sending him tumbling through smoke and collapsing alloy. For one suspended moment, the roar of detonation swallowed every sound. Then the tower began to fall inward around him. Then everything went silent. The roar of collapsing metal faded into a low, distant hum inside Ethan's damaged helmet. Audio sensors glitched, replacing chaos with hollow static. Dust and ionized smoke filled the chamber, drifting in strange arcs as gravity fluctuated unpredictably. His HUD flickered, half the interface dark, the other half feeding broken data streams. External comms dropped entirely. No voices, no commands, only the slow ticking of his suit's failing systems. Oxygen levels blinked at 72% and falling. Pain pulsed along his ribs where impact armor had cracked. He tried to move. Debris pinned his lower body beneath twisted alloy beams. Outside the fractured structure, the sky glowed intermittently from distant fragment impacts, but even those flashes reached him as muted light through smoke. For the first time since the alarm began, there was no immediate instruction, no next step, only stillness, heavy and uncertain. The silence shattered as a secondary fragment punched through the atmosphere somewhere beyond the fault line, even buried beneath wreckage. Ethan felt the shockwave roll through the crust like a living thing. The ground convulsed violently, sending fractured beams grinding deeper into his armor. A distant flash turned the smoke around him blood red for a split second, followed by a delayed thunder that rattled his remaining suit sensors. Seismic readings flickered across his visor, registering catastrophic displacement across an entire continental shelf. Tsunami alerts triggered automatically before cutting to static. Another tremor rippled outward, collapsing what remained of the tower's upper structure in a cascade of metal and sparks. The planet was taking direct hits now. No corridor adjustment could erase what had already fallen. Ethan stared at the failing oxygen counter, realizing survival was no longer theoretical. The cost had begun. Ethan lay pinned beneath a lattice of warped alloy and fractured composite panels, the weight pressing against his legs like a vice. Dust floated in sluggish spirals as gravity fluctuated unpredictably around the collapsed chamber. His visor display sputtered back to life in partial segments, oxygen at 64%. Suit integrity compromised, external radiation climbing. He tried to shift his torso. Pain flared sharply across his ribs where the armor had cracked. Every movement sent small avalanches of debris sliding down around him. The air tasted metallic even through filtration systems. Above, faint tremors hinted at continued fragment impacts across the planet. No communication channels responded to his attempts at transmission. He was alone inside a dead tower, kilometers from stable infrastructure. The gravity corridor flickered weakly in diagnostic memory logs. Survival now depended on what remained inside his suit and inside himself. Pinned beneath twisted metal, Ethan stared at the oxygen counter slipping toward red. 60%. 58. Each decrement felt louder than the distant tremors shaking the ruins above. His suit still carried an emergency beacon and enough fusion reserve to power a short-range distress burst, if he conserved energy and waited. Rescue might come. But the gravity grid remained unstable, without manual rebalancing from the primary core. Remaining fragments could realign toward populated zones. He pulled up fragmented system logs through his cracked visor. The corridor required one final phase lock, something only a direct core feed could provide. That meant rerouting his suit's fusion cell into the tower's broken spine, sacrificing propulsion and beacon power. If he did it, he might save the planet and die unseen beneath rubble. If he didn't, he might live while others burned. The choice narrowed to identity. Ethan disengaged the emergency beacon and unlocked the fusion cell housing at his suit's spine. Warning glyphs flared immediately. Loss of propulsion, loss of autonomous extraction, irreversible commitment. He dragged one arm free from beneath the alloy beam, fingers scraping toward the exposed core conduit jutting from the fractured chamber floor. Gravity pulsed weakly through the damaged tower, waiting for alignment, with trembling precision. He spliced the fusion output leads into the manual override port. Energy surged violently through the cable, suit systems dimming as power drained away. Heat flooded his armor, temperature thresholds climbing toward failure. "Phase lock," he whispered, forcing the command through clenched teeth. The corridor outside responded, its harmonic frequency stabilizing in distant telemetry echoes. Oxygen dipped into the 40s. There would be no retreat now. He had wagered his escape for a planet's survival. The fusion feed roared through the shattered conduit, flooding the gravity core with raw, unstable power. Across Olivium's equator, dormant towers flickered back to life as the harmonic grid realigned under the sudden surge. Space above the planet rippled visibly, bending in a smooth, coherent arc once more. Inside the collapsed chamber, Ethan felt the vibration shift from chaotic tremor to focused resonance. Warning indicators cascaded across his visor as suit power drained into the network. Systems shutting down one by one to sustain the feed. External telemetry, barely registering through fragmented channels, confirmed stabilization across multiple nodes. The corridor thickened, its curvature strengthening enough to capture drifting fragments still descending toward lethal vectors. Heat bled through Ethan's armor, the fusion channel scorching near its limits. Oxygen dropped again, but the planet's gravitational signature steadied. The surge had taken hold. The stabilized corridor tightened its curvature, capturing the largest remaining fragment as it descended through the upper atmosphere. Fire trailed across the sky, but its path began to arc sideways, pulled by the reinforced gravity field. Secondary debris followed, dragged into a widening slingshot vector that bent away from populated regions. In the defense center, fragmented telemetry feeds flickered back online, confirming impact projections, shifting outward into uninhabited oceanic zones. Shockwaves still rippled through cloud layers, but the lethal trajectories thinned with each passing second. Ethan felt the resonance change inside the ruined tower, the violent tremor easing into controlled vibration. The planet's gravitational harmonics no longer screamed. They hummed. Oxygen in his suit fell into critical margins, alarms flashing amber. Yet through the haze of heat and pressure, one truth emerged clearly. The sky was no longer falling. The gravity grid stabilized fully, and rescue signals finally pierced the static surrounding the fault zone. Search drones descended through lingering radiation clouds, scanning thermal signatures beneath the collapsed tower. One drone locked onto faint heat readings buried deep within the debris field. Automated cutters ignited, slicing through warped alloy as shock-absorbent braces prevented further collapse. Ethan drifted in and out of awareness, oxygen dipping into the 30s, suit systems almost entirely dark. A mechanical arm breached the chamber and latched onto his armor, securing a magnetic tether around his torso. Debris shifted violently as extraction thrusters engaged, hauling him upward through smoke and fractured steel. Fresh air flooded the rescue capsule as his helmet was sealed into a life support dock. Outside, the sky no longer burned. The planet still stood. From the balcony of the Planetary Recovery Center, Ethan looked out over a horizon permanently altered. Entire coastal regions lay reshaped where redirected fragments had struck uninhabited oceans. Steam plumes still rising into a bruised sky. One distant continent bore a dark scar where the earlier impact had torn through crust and cities alike. Reconstruction drones moved in disciplined patterns below, rebuilding atmospheric stabilizers and power relays piece by fragile piece. The gravity towers along the equator stood blackened and partially collapsed. Monuments to the price paid. Air quality monitors blinked steady green again. But the planet carried a silence heavier than before. Survival had not come cleanly. It had carved its path through loss. Ethan felt the ache of healing ribs beneath reinforced medical plating as wind brushed against the balcony shield. Olivium lived, but it would never be untouched again. Ethan stood beside the High Queen in the central plaza, where emergency beacons had once burned red. Now, reconstruction lights glowed steady across the fractured skyline. Citizens gathered quietly, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. The 5 who had stood with him through the crisis remained at his side. Saris composed and analytical, Kayla resolute, Mira watchful, Celine focused, Arya calm as ever. He no longer felt like an outsider calculating angles of advantage. The planet's wounds were etched into his memory as clearly as the cracked armor once pressed against his ribs. When the Queen formally offered him the role of consort and planetary engineer, he did not hesitate, not out of pride, nor obligation, but understanding. Survival had stripped away pretense and left choice. He chose to stay, not as a savior, but as someone accountable for what endured and what was lost. Night settled over Olivium beneath a sky no longer torn by fire. The stars appeared sharper, almost distant, as if the universe itself had stepped back after testing the planet's resolve. Ethan stood alone at the edge of the repaired equatorial tower, the new gravity core humming steadily beneath reinforced plating. Scars from the detonation remained etched into the surrounding terrain, visible reminders of what survival had demanded. Atmospheric readings held stable. The corridor grid idled quietly, ready if ever needed again. Wind carried the scent of ionized metal and new construction. He rested a hand on the tower's railing, feeling its steady vibration, controlled, purposeful. The man who once arrived chasing admiration had chosen responsibility instead. Behind him, lights of rebuilding cities shimmered like constellations, reborn on the surface below. The sky was calm, but the cost of keeping it that way would never be forgotten. Olivium survived, but not without scars. And Ethan survived too, changed forever by the weight of his choice. In the end, this was never just about deflecting an asteroid. It was about identity, sacrifice, and the courage to become someone worthy of survival. When the sky falls, we discover who we truly are. If this journey moved you, follow the channel and join us for the next story, because beyond every horizon, another test awaits.